Hello all. My name is Corinne Donnelly, and I'm a senior fellow with the Center for Writing and Scholarship at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And this is the 8th workshop in a series of workshops called Foundations of Academic Writing, specifically intended for the students in the Bachelor Completion Program at CIIS. So we've been focusing each week on a different aspect of academic writing, sort of narrowing as we go from bigger picture ideas like thesis statements and structuring an argument, introductory paragraphs, body paragraphs, that kind of stuff, to the more sentence level stuff. So last week we talked about transitions and flow, and today we're doing something a little bit similar. We're talking specifically about using academic, I'm going to put that in quotes too, using academic language, which primarily I think will just be a discussion of more formal language choices versus more informal language choices. So with all that in mind, I think we're going to kick off the way that we usually kick off by doing a free write. So if you are at home and you have your notebook and writing implement ready, I'm going to go ahead and give you some things to write about. If you've been attending these workshops or, like watching them online, then I'm guessing the questions I'm about to ask aren't going to be a big surprise. But I'm getting my timing device, my phone, ready. And for the first minute, for 1 minute, I would love you to just respond to the question, who are you? In any way you like. Who are you? Go. Great, that's 1 minute. Let's do another minute now. So let's do 1 minute on what brought you here today. Great. 1 minute, go. Great, okay, that's another minute. Here's the last minute. Let's do, where are you in your writing process? So in asking this, I'm assuming that you are probably a student and that you are probably working on some sort of paper, especially now that we're nearing the end of the semester. So we're gonna do 1 minute with where are you at? Where are you in your writing process? Okay, there we go. You wind that up. Okay, so if you would look back over the things that you've just written and see if you can sort of synthesize those into what would be an introduction. Were you here to actually speak with me in person, how you might introduce yourself. So maybe just 30 seconds to look over those notes. I'm going to do it. Okay, so if you want to stop there. Now I'm going to throw you, which is really just throwing myself, a little curveball, and say that in the place of where we would normally do these introductions, I wanna try a little bit of a stylistic tweak. So I am still going to introduce myself to you, but now I'm going to take on a certain character as I do it. So this character will inform how I choose to present myself to you. I came up with a list of possible characters. I was thinking like a philosopher, a scientist, a third grade teacher, maybe a sports coach. All of these characters probably use language a little bit differently because they're using the language to communicate to various audiences who probably receive language differently. So by way of introducing myself, I'm just going to take, I guess, the first one off the list here and improvise and try to do it for you as a philosopher. Okay. In that one can never really know what a person is, I approach this question of identity with hesitation. Were I to thoroughly mine the depths of myself, I might find nothing of substance. Yet, insofar as I am a being who exists in the greater world, which is full of social contracts and a consensus reality, I can offer the following markers of conventional identity. I am myself, am a philosopher. I've received my master's degree in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. I am a queer identified person. I am a lover of things called anything that might broadly fit under the category of the mystery. In my former versions of myself, I have been an artist, a performer. I'm a great lover of the arts, a patron. I attend the theater. And it's a bit of a catch-22 in this instance, because here I am introducing myself to you, and I have presented myself with the challenge of answering this question of why am I here, and yet I'm here to lead a workshop for you in academic writing. That would be the immediate reason, and yet I am constantly questioning, investigating the structures around myself, pontificating upon what they might mean and why they exist. And of course, here I sit in the ivory tower asking questions about the university itself. It is my goal to investigate academic conventions while simultaneously questioning them. That is one reason why I'm here today. Of course, in my own process, being a recent graduate of this said philosophy program, I am in the place of developing myself professionally. I find that most of my writing these days has to do with creating cover letters or content for a website I might design these sorts of things that will help me to promote myself. So no longer is my writing strictly academic anymore. It's bridging into other arenas with different intended audiences. Thank you so much for your time. Okay. That was a silly introduction. I think I got a little bit lost, perhaps, in playing the character of the philosopher. Maybe just now to do that a different way, I will switch to the third grade teacher and see if I can do a similar introduction for you as a third grade teacher. Good evening, everyone. My name is Corinne. I'm excited to be here with you today. I am a teacher. I have been a student, just like you, and I am primarily interested in anything mysterious in the world. I wonder why things came to be the way they are. I love the arts. I love going to the theater. I love writing. And I'm here today to talk to you about writing and to look at some of the ways our writing changes depending on who we're speaking to. When I write for myself, it takes on a whole range of different ways of speaking. My writing can look a lot of different ways depending on who I'm talking to. Sometimes I'm writing papers for school and I find myself using lots of big words because I know that my teachers are going to read them and maybe I think they like big words. But sometimes I'm writing for my friends, and then it doesn't seem so important. It's more important to me when I'm writing for my friends that I come off as an approachable, trustworthy person. So, how I write changes depending on who I'm writing for. Does that make sense? Okay, so at this point, I would love for you to consider what some of the stylistic differences between my two introductions were. I think some of the things I was going for, I don't know how successful I was in achieving, but I was going for simpler language in the second one, sentences that were shorter, words that were a little more commonly known. So maybe I avoided words like pontificating when I was speaking to the third graders. And I wanted to seem much more approachable to them. Whereas probably it was more important to me when speaking as a philosopher or potentially speaking to other philosophers that I entertain range of options or come off as a thoughtful person. So less for me in that instance about getting everyone on board and excited about what I had to talk about, and more about like mining for the truth. And probably also because I was speaking to a philosophical audience, I wanted to give a lot of caveats. I wanted to go for like longer, more complicated sentences. Wanted to resist even precise definitions because I knew that they could be argued with. Whereas in the second version, the third grade version, I probably wasn't anticipating much pushback from my audience. So I felt a little more confidence in saying things boldly and perhaps oversimplifying them. That was the internal experience of it. I'm sure there are other observations to be made technically about what I did, but it's probably apparent at this point that the larger thing I'm trying to get at is that the language choices that we make, and even the choices regarding sentence structure, length of sentences, complexity of ideas, all of these very much depend on who we're talking to. So this is a point that we brought up last week when we were talking about voice, and I'd like to stress it again, and that, so last week we were talking about voice vis-a-vis flow, And there's sort of this expectation often that flow just means you're really cooking with an idea, and it's coming easily and you're rocking it out. Whereas I like to think of flow as happening more in the revision process. You're strategically linking one idea or one sentence to the next. And in order to do that, you have a whole list of like cohesive devices that we went over and transition words that you can use to help to map the relationships. So similarly, I don't think of voice necessarily as something to be cultivated that's like a hard and fast identity, and I always write this way, and get on board with me as a writer because I write long sentences, and sometimes, you know, like they're grammatically all over the place, but that's my style. I think a voice having a lot more to do with audience and with how you're trying to change the audience. So if you're writing in creative genre and engaging the audience is more about getting them on board with your creative style, then I think you have a lot more play in terms of how you want to use language and stuff. And maybe there it is appropriate to have grammatically dubious sentences and very long ones, or merging words together, or making up new words, or any sort of fun thing you might want to do. That seems appropriate to me for more creative writing. But the further we tip into more academic writing or formal writing, I think that there are definite signifiers of an academic voice that can be mapped and worked through and strategically cultivated, much like one cultivates flow strategically and in the revision process. So just like I was the same person, actually describing basically the same ideas with reduction with those two different characters, I think that you can be the same person and have the same content you want to deliver, but vary your strategies, so vary your voice depending on who you're trying to talk to. And in all likelihood, in the academic sphere, you're talking to people within your discourse community, within your academic discipline, or those who work in the field that you're trying to apprentice yourself into, you know, via your academic studies. That said, I would like to take a second and maybe just think broadly about what markers of an academic voice are. So when we think of speaking academically or in like a formal tone, what comes to mind? I guess some of them I maybe modeled earlier, or the ones that I would come up with. I'm sure that in your head you have some different suggestions that I'm not privy to right now. But I think of large words, complex sentences, sometimes like a deliberate obfuscation. I don't even know if that's the word I mean. And over complexifying of certain ideas. I think of a lot of words related to argument, so about proving something and defending something. I think about the active voice rather than the passive voice. I think about fewer personal examples being used, and maybe more more time spent in analytic spaces. So a real dissection of topics. So maybe I want to take something back here, because I've said deliberately complex language, but I think academic writing can also involve very simple to point language. Maybe though, if we're going to boil this down, I think of, so the bottom line for me is that academic writing, the voice of it is often authoritative. And I say that because I've sort of been, throughout this whole series, drawing a parallel or maybe even conflating, but academic writing and argumentative writing. And my main contention has been that all academic writing is about trying to convince someone of something, making an argument. And all of these strategies, which are geared at an audience, are about demonstrating one's authority in making that argument. So someone's, you are trying to convey to your audience that you are a trustworthy source, such that you might more easily convince them of this argument. So if we think of authority as being the thing you're trying to go for, how you demonstrate that authority is still going to change depending on who you're talking to and who's in your discipline. Maybe an academic voice is an authoritative one. That's me riffing. Ideally, this would be more of a conversation, but please have the conversation with me in your own head. So, as always, I guess I want to give the caveat here, or give the reminder that less important than this sort of like sentence level stuff that we've been talking about last week and this week is more of the big picture stuff that we started with. So you can have the most formal language in the world, and it's not going to support anything if your argument isn't well developed. So the real work of academic writing is still in finding the thesis statement, getting the right evidence to support it, using analysis to map that evidence to like support the main argument, right? Constantly mapping back. That's where you're really going to demonstrate your authority, really going to defend your argument. This sort of writing stuff, this sort of sentence stuff, is just icing on the cake once you've already figured that out. Okay, so with that being said, let's maybe look at some of the markers of formal language in academic writing. So first I'm going to start by pulling up this. Okay, the screen share thing going here. Okay, so this is about the use of formal language in the development of an academic writing voice. Doesn't that already sound kind of academic? So we're going to move through each of these. I'm going to try to explain them a little bit as we move through them. There are what, 12 points here. And in some cases, as I state them, I'm also going to state exceptions to the rules. Because as I said in my introduction, I think it's, or as I tried to say, I think it's great to know what the standard conventions of academic writing are, but at the same time, it's great to feel you have the authority to break them whenever you're doing it for a good reason, whenever it seems the more effective choice for how to communicate with your audience. Okay, so let's start with this first one here. This might be familiar to you. In more formal writing, you generally want to avoid the use of contractions. So instead of saying, "You are going to the party tonight," you would say, "You are going to the party tonight." They are interested in a lot of things. The more appropriate formal way to say that would be, "They are interested in a lot of things." If you're trying to cultivate a more formal tone or to converse with your audience in a more colloquial way, you might want to include contractions. But again, if you're going formal, I'm going to break up your contractions to be all of their full words in their full word cells. All right. Number 2, you're going to avoid addressing the reader as you. So what we're talking about here is direct address of the audience. Now, if you address the audience as you, you're making a real assumption. You can be making assumptions about who they are, and it brings you off of the page in a strange way, perhaps. So I didn't explain that in the best way possible, but if you look at this example, note the results in table 1 is preferred to you can see the results in table 1. Okay, so the effect is the same. You're still asking the reader to observe the results, but in saying note, you're not directly addressing the reader in the same way. A different way to do this would be to say 1 can see the results instead of note the results, but even this is probably more concise, this note the results. Okay. If you were writing an instructional paper, or again, something that was a little more colloquial, you might then choose to use you. Third here, avoid overusing direct questions. So this is kind of similar. Instead of saying, what can be done about it, you could rephrase that as the next step is to consider all options. Okay, so it's another kind of like direct address thing, and saying what can be done about it. It's really like offering up a direct question to the reader, whereas there's something more formal about taking the distance to say the next step is to consider all options. That said, questions, this is a place where there's a definite exception. It's funny. Questions can be a really effective rhetorical device, and oftentimes in introductions you'll see someone stating the questions that inspired their inquiry in the first place, from which they have generated the thesis statement. So sometimes when I want to include questions in my writing, but I don't want to risk the more informal move of just asking them outright, I will introduce the questions with a little, with a statement like, this begs the question, or in response, one might ask. And so I sort of set up the question, and then I put a little colon, and I ask the question itself. And for me, this sort of makes the question less direct. I get to use it, but it still gets to be formal. So, so that can look, yeah, as I was saying, something like, this begs the question, what steps are to be taken? Right? Which still seems a little bit more formal than what can be done about it. Okay, great. Now we're getting a bit more technical. Placing number 4, placing adverbs within the sentence. So rather than saying the situation is quickly worse, rather than saying quickly, the situation is worsening, the adverb right there is directly next to the thing it's describing. So adverbs describe adjectives or other verbs. Well, do I mean that? Adverbs. The adverb here is describing how the situation is worsening. So it's worsening quickly, right? So if you do it the second way and say quickly, the situation is worsening, the quickly is like next to the situation, right? But it's preferable for it to be next to worsening. Okay. This makes me feel a little silly talking through it because I'm not sure what seems intuitive or like is easy to grasp and which isn't. So I feel like I'm just sort of talking at the air, but I hope all of this is making sense and is not too boring for you. Let's move on. Here's a funny one. Try not to split an infinitive, number 5. Okay, so an infinitive would be the form of the verb before it's been, or it's like base form of the verb. So to rise, to talk, right? Like a past tense would be rose or talked. But in its base form, the infinitive is to rise. So in trying not to split an infinitive, it means you're trying not to put the adverb in between the to and the rise, so that you're not into like the base form of the verb. So you wouldn't want to say to sharply rise, you would want to say to rise sharply. Okay? So the infinitive will be tipped off by this to word. To rise sharply is preferred. We want also to aim for an efficient use of words. So this maybe runs contrary to what we were saying earlier about academic writing sometimes seeing more convoluted or wordy in its expression. The efficient use of words here makes choosing the paper method maybe difficult, preferable to it may be difficult to make a decision about the method that we should use. See, that's a lot of words to say a pretty simple thing. That said, you might find that you enjoy stylistically, like, well, this might be a way of pontificating or leaving room for doubt to say it may be difficult. But even still, there's a simpler way to say to make a decision about the method that we should use, right? It could just be summed up with the word choose. So we're aiming for an efficient use of words. Here's one that gets a ton of exceptions, but I guess the general convention, number 7, is to avoid the overuse of personal pronouns such as I, we, our, and you. So we already covered the speaking directly to the audience and saying to avoid you earlier. But the personal pronouns, I, we, our, make your writing necessarily personal. Now, in the reflective genre, which we've talked an okay amount about in this workshop so far, and actually I think broadly in academic writing, it's becoming more and more acceptable to use I, and there are good reasons for this. A lot of it has to do with the fact that when you don't use I and you're pretending, it's like you're pretending that you're a disembodied person. So saying I can be a really effective way to state your positionality and to make it clear that you are a person making an argument rather than this strange, authoritative, as I said, disembodied voice. So most of the time when I write a paper, I feel pretty comfortable saying I. That said, I will use it sparingly, or I will do it in particular to express something that is distinctly my opinion and doesn't assume a universality of opinion. So that's how I'll use I. Now, we and our, I'm a little more cautious about, because the problem with we is it more directly assumes a universality. So if I say, we love academic writing, the reader, who might not care about academic writing, is probably asking themselves, who is this we, and why does the author think that she can speak for me? So if ever I'm going to use we, I will try to specify who we stands for. So we citizens of the United States is better than just saying we, or we Westerners is a different move than saying we love, we think capitalism is awesome. Well, there are a lot of people that would probably disagree with that statement. So better to, if you're going to say we, to define who the we stands for. Nevertheless, The more academically formal way to do it, as I said, is to avoid the use of personal pronouns. So instead of saying, I believe that capital punishment is wrong, you might just make the argument outright and say capital punishment is wrong. When we were talking, here's another addendum. Here is an addendum. When we were talking in the thesis workshop about thesis statements, I think it probably came up that a lot of people will argue instead of saying in your paper, in this paper, I will argue that it is preferable to avoid personal pronouns. You should just go ahead and say it. It is preferable to avoid personal pronouns. The reader will go ahead and assume that it's your personal argument. So it may be more authoritative and it may be a little more confident to just go ahead and state something like this and assume that the reader knows it's your particular argument. But again, there's probably a lot of leeway, and you do see a lot of academic writers saying, in this paper, I will argue. So I would say that that kind of thing is more of a choice unless you have an instructor who's voiced a strong opinion about it and maybe would prefer that you avoid any sort of in this paper sort of thing. But, you know, again, all of this is how you want to come off to your reader. Sometimes I do want to come off as a little bit less authoritative, or I want to leave a little more room for doubt even in my own argument. Depends on who I'm communicating to and why. Number 8, do not use solely male pronouns. Okay, so once upon a time, way back, it was the proper grammatical convention to assume always a male actor, to say he should have the option to. So you see this in like, when one goes to the store, he should buy artichokes. Okay. Some years ago, that really switched. And it's no longer appropriate to assume that the actor, the person doing something in a sentence, is always male, right? Male, gendered male. So it's commonly accepted to vary the use of pronouns. So sometimes you might see this as he or she should have the option to. This can get a little bit cumbersome, so I find myself, instead of saying he or she each time, especially because I don't think that he or she maps all of the genders available, I will switch my pronouns up. Sometimes I will say he should have the option to. Sometimes I will say she should have the option to. And I'll just keep these switching throughout my paper, and I think that that is pretty grammatically or academically acceptable. Now, this said, it even feels a little bit limiting to me with my own approach to gender and my own identity as more of a genderqueer person. It strikes me as a little limiting or not all that advanced to just alternate between these pronouns. So I try to push my own writing to also include they sometimes, which I think will be jarring to anyone who reads it when they realize I'm speaking about a single actor, but calling that actor they. So this is a choice that I sometimes make in my writing, knowing that it might confuse audiences, and it's a good example of how I'm trying to use my language to impact audiences. So I can't vouch for that. I'm actually not sure where the Academy is at with the use of they, but a good rule of thumb is just to switch up between he or she in the writing. Great. Number 9, we're going to avoid the use of slang, jargon, cliches, and conversational language. Okay, so this is a little bit more of a subjective one, but you see here her research includes a whole bunch of ideas. Well, a whole bunch is pretty colloquial. Again, it's really conversational and is not very specific. So a great rule of thumb, maybe just rather than avoiding these things, is to try to be as specific always in your writing as possible. So several tells me 3 or more, which is a little bit more specific than whole bunch, right? So to say her research includes several ideas is better than her research includes a whole bunch of ideas. Don't have any good examples coming to the top of my head of what cliches are, but of what a cliche might look like. But cliches too have the same problem of being overly simplistic. And the real problem is that the reader probably isn't getting anything new out of anything new out of that cliche. So there's really no new way of looking at the world that you're supplying them by saying it. Yeah, okay. We'll move on from that one. I want to avoid pretentious language. So just as you want to avoid cliches and slang and jargon, conversational language, similarly, you want to avoid pretentious language. So instead of saying to perpetuate our endeavor of providing funds for elderly citizens as we do at the present moment, we will face the exigency of enhanced contributions from all of our citizens. Really, that's just convoluted and hard to understand. A better way to say it would be citizens cannot continue to fund Social Security for elderly citizens unless we raise taxes. It's to the point. Really, you do want your reader to understand what you're saying. So better to just say it outright. Once again, though, depending on who your audience is, you might want to beef up your language a little bit to amp it up. To impress the audience. I would just do it in moderation or do it cautiously, and maybe the real test here is to always know what you're saying. And if you can say, what I'm trying to say here is, and say it a different way, say it more simply, probably better to go with the simpler way. Because sometimes we have these longer sentences when we're still trying to find our wording. And there is a more concise, more effective way to say it. Number 11 here, use an active rather than a passive voice unless you are describing a scientific procedure. Okay, so for this moment, accepting scientific procedures, this is actually a pretty big one, using an active voice rather than a passive voice. So here's the example of the passive voice. The law was passed by Mayor Johnson. Okay, and the active voice is Mayor Johnson passed the law. What this basically means is that Mayor Johnson, who is the subject, is doing the action, okay, which is the verb. So Mayor Johnson is passing the law in this sentence. The passive voice, right, is here represented in was passed, okay? And so the person doing the passing, right, is coming after the verb here. And the more dangerous way that you will see this represented in writing is the law was passed. Why is this dangerous? Well, it sort of absolves anyone of culpability. So say that the law was a really controversial law and nobody knew who passed it. The law was passed would be a way of saying that it was passed without naming the person who was responsible for it, right? So it's kind of like absolving that person of any responsibility. So it can be very sneaky to use the passive voice to just say that something happened without a subject. But in reality, every verb, everything that happens is done by an actor, right? So better to just be upfront about it and to say deliberately who did what. So that's the passive voice. Mayor Johnson passed that's the active voice. Mayor Johnson passed the law. Okay. Then finally, number 12. This is kind of like what I was saying earlier with the thesis statement, but say it, do not say that you will say it. So instead of saying, in this paper, I will analyze the arguments against handgun control, you might just say, arguments against handgun control include blah, 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 blah. Once again, this is a little bit of a matter of taste. You will see plenty of academic writers saying in this paper, I will analyze, as a way of naming outright what the reader can look out for that they're going to do. But the sort of stronger argumentative device is probably to just go ahead and make the argument and to make it really specifically. And with this distinction in particular, with these two examples, the bigger problem I have with this latter one, with in this paper, I will analyze the arguments against handgun control, is that I have no idea yet as the reader, what these arguments will entail. So I've got to read through the paper to get to them. Whereas if I have a thesis statement, if I read one that says arguments against gun control will include, and the reader tells me with the rest of the sentence, the stuff that's going to count as evidence, I have a better idea of whether or not I want to keep reading. So the former makes for ultimately a more specific thesis statement, which is what we want to go for. Okay. Okay, so that was a long time for you to sit with just the document, and I hope it wasn't horrifically boring. It's so hard to know in these instances. But now that we've looked at that, okay, let's perhaps practice converting a paragraph. So I want to look at this handout. I'm going to go away again. Converting non-scholarly writing into scholarly writing, an exercise. This is sort of the companion piece to what we were just looking at. Okay, so this handout provides two paragraphs on greenery. First one, the joy of spinach. The second one, common purslane, a source of omega-3 fatty acids and antioxidants. Well, if you had to guess which is the more academic piece. Rather than looking at the second paragraph, I think it's maybe more effective to look at this first one. And based on everything we've just talked about, kind of try to flag some of the things that are less than academic or less than formal in this top paragraph. So it reads, the joy of spinach. I am a fan of spinach. You can't beat it. Not only is spinach loaded with iron, vitamin C, and antioxidants, but it also tastes delicious. Spinach is also versatile. You can throw it into an omelet or add bacon, mushroom, and red onions and turn it into a delicious salads. Spanakopita, anyone? Spinach is also relatively cheap. You can buy a boatload of this stuff for just 3 weeks at a farmer's market. All right. Well, what is not so formal or scholarly about this? Okay. First thing that jumps out, the use of I, okay, and the use of you. So already the reader is pretty familiar with the audience. That might be less than formal. Here we have a use of a contraction, can't beat it, instead of you cannot beat it. We have definitely some examples of conversational language, so loaded with a boatload of the stuff. $3 instead of $3. Those all jump out as being pretty conversational. Again, more of this direct address to the audience. You can throw it into an omelet or add bacon. Here we have a question. Spanakopita, anyone? This also isn't even a full sentence. And like I said, is a question. I also am noticing this like repetition of also that happens a lot. But it also tastes delicious. Spinach is also versatile. Spinach is also relatively cheap. So we have a lot of kind of the same sentence structure happening over and over again. That's a little more in line with some of the stuff we talked about last week in terms of tactics for cohesion. So now, as you could probably guess, we're gonna take a second to convert this into more formal language, okay? So I'm gonna come back for just a second and say the goal of this is to take maybe 5 to 10 minutes and see if you can rewrite this paragraph in a more formal way. Now, I wouldn't pay too much attention to the bottom one, which seems almost like a rewriting. It's not, but is really kind of like scientific in tone and probably meant for a more scientific audience. So let's just think about if we were to convert this for just a generally academic audience. If you were writing it for a professor and trying to observe some of the conventions of more formal writing, how you would rewrite this. So I'm gonna mute my own microwave. I don't know what is up with my language today. Microphone. I'm gonna mute my own microphone and see if I can do a quick rewriting of this and share with you what I have in about 5 minutes time. Okay, so I'll be here typing away. I'm going to put the paragraph up on the screen so you can see it and do it yourself. And here we go. Okay. Talk about leaving you alone. That might have been longer than 5 minutes. I stopped watching the clock, I have to admit, because I got a little bit lost in this assignment. I don't even know if I fully stand behind what I've done, but I'm going to read it aloud to you and we can talk about it. Here we go. Here's one more screen share. Okay, so if we scroll down here, here's my version of the above paragraph. So, spinach, an affordable and easy addition to any meal. Spinach deserves greater recognition amongst other leafy green vegetables. Not only does it contain iron, antioxidants, and vitamin C, but it is mild enough in taste, and most palates can appreciate it. What is more, the culinary versatility of spinach means that one can incorporate it into dishes as simple as salad or as complex as spanakopita. Best of all, spinach is reliably inexpensive. One can usually buy a full bag of it at a farmer's market for under $3. Okay. So, all right, some basic changes that we made. I went for a more complex title. I threw in this colon just to make it seem fancy. I didn't mean to repeat and, it's like that, an affordable and easy addition to any meal, okay? I also wanted the title to be more representative of the topics I was going to cover in my little blurb, in my paragraph here. So I began it with an argument that was a little more of an argument than just, I'm a fan of spinach, you can't eat it. I began with spinach deserves greater recognition amongst other leafy green vegetables. So there's something I'm contending here that someone could argue with me about. Let's call that my topic sentence for this paragraph, okay? So what this following paragraph is going to be about, what I'm arguing for, that it deserves greater recognition. Okay, so I've kept a little bit of this here. Not only does it contain, so I swapped out contain for loaded with, for a bit more formal of a word. Not only does it contain iron, antioxidants, and vitamin C, but it is mild enough in taste, and most palates can appreciate it. Actually, I'm going to edit this here in front of you and say, but it is mild in taste, and most palates can appreciate it. So rather than saying that it's like delicious, I'm a bit more specific about it here, and a little less, I'm speaking a little less from a personal place of like, it's so good, but more talking about the taste. And I said most palates can appreciate it, and I wrestled with this because I was trying to speak in the active voice, so I wanted the palates to do the appreciating. But the original way I wanted to word this is, but it is mild enough in taste to be appreciated by most palates. Okay, so that would be an example of, I guess, some passive voice that I was tempted to throw in there. And that probably I might have made the decision to keep in because the mild enough sort of set it up for me so that the spinach was mild and the sort of passive clause that followed to be appreciated by most palates didn't seem all that threatening to me. But I wrote it this way. Here we can debate the merits of this one versus the other version. To continue, what is more, the culinary versatility of spinach means that one can incorporate it into dishes as simple as salad or as complex as spanakopita. So here I'm saying one instead of you. And I instead of having that question of like spanakopita, anyone? I tried to set it up as like a contrast between simple dishes and more complex ones, but with the idea that spinach that is versatile and can be used in either. I elected to cut the bit about the omelet and the specifics of bacon, mushrooms, and red onions. Maybe that was a silly omission. I would love to hear different versions that found a way to work that in. But for me, it didn't seem as important to getting at the crux of my argument, which is about spinach and not about those other things. Best of all, spinach is reliably inexpensive. Here we have, okay. So instead of saying it's also relatively cheap, instead of the word cheap, I used inexpensive. So reliably inexpensive. One can usually buy a full bag of it at a farmer's market for under $3. So instead of bucks, I said dollars. And instead of a boatload, I said a full bag. And I didn't want to seem overly confident about what other people's farmers markets look like, so I said usually. I used one again instead of you. And that's what I did in terms of those markers of academic language that we looked at before. Now, I also want to point out that I tried to use some transitions here, more so than were used in the original paragraph. So I added this what is more as a transition. I used best of all to sort of mark what I thought was the crux of my argument that we had been building to throughout. Here we have it, which is like a pronoun that harkens back to spinach. That would be a device for cohesion that we discussed last week. Same thing happens here, it, best of all. Spinach, the it harkens back to the spinach. I think you get the picture. It might be an interesting exercise for you who are at home to look back at your paragraph and think about how you made changes to it and see if there are any lexical devices for cohesion you'd like to go throw in there. So just to sort of, I guess, like a little recap of where we left off last week, let's remind ourselves of what some of those cohesive devices are. So we have the repetition of a key term, contemporary art, Here's twice. We have synonyms, so myths narrate sacred histories and explain sacred origins. These traditional narratives, so traditional narratives is a way of renaming myths. We've got pronouns. When scientific experiments do not work out, they, sort of like spinach, it, okay? But the pronoun harkens back to scientific experiments, and those can include this, that, these, those, he, she, it, they, we. Again, we want to be careful about we. And we want to always be sure that it's clear what our pronouns are referring back to, right? Same with what our synonyms are referring back to. You know, if you're going to say these traditional narratives, you definitely should have said myths so that there's a definite link between the two of these. If that makes sense. Got transitional words in addition, but, and, yet, right? And then we have parallel sentence patterns. Ask not what you can do for your country. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Okay? You get all that? Sort of makes sense. If you're still with me through all of this, I applaud you, because again, this kind of material can get tedious, and to just listen to me talk through handouts, it's not that much fun. But I would like to propose to you some different ways that you can play with voice in your own writing, or with the formality of your voice. Kind of like that first exercise we did where I spoke aloud as different characters. You can try that too. You can think about who your intended audience is, and when making, what kind of a character making an argument to that audience, and what kind of choices, sentence structure-wise, word-wise, that person would use, that character would use. That's one approach. Another game that I have played but happily play with anyone in the online space with me is what I'm calling a formality meter. So this is what I propose you do. Take 10 minutes to think about the topic that you're writing about, and to free write about it. Sort of like we did at the beginning. Just let yourself write on what your basic argument is, what maybe evidence you have, If you feel like you're far enough into it, you could free write a paragraph or two about your argument, okay? Do that for 10 minutes. Then pair up with someone and spend 1 minute first just talking to them about your project, so about your free write, everything you wrote down, however you wrote it, and as yourself, okay? Then let the person listening, who will also be the timekeeper ideally, after 1 minute, let them give you a reading of what they think your formality level was. So if 0 is like super casual, colloquial, is that even a sentence? That, you know, that kind of thing. And 10 is like uber formal, distance, I'm afraid to approach you. Where on the meter do you fall? Ask your partner to tell you where on the meter, 0 to 10. Okay, so starting at whatever level you fell at, then begin talking about your argument as you were, and let your partner keep a little meter going here, right? And to raise the level, or to lower the level of your formality as you speak. So try that for a couple minutes of talking and attempting as you relate your ideas to amplify the formality of your lexical choices, or to lessen them as you're speaking. I think it's a joke, it might be kind of a fun thing, okay? And so that you can do for a couple minutes. And then finally, you can think for a second about who you intend your audience for this paper to be, for the one that you're writing, that you just rewrote about. Share with your partner what you think on that scale of 1 to 10 a healthy formality level would be. And you take 1 minute trying to speak, to extemporize at that formality level. And then following that, get some feedback from your partner. Let them let you know what worked, what didn't work, as the intended audience that you just named, what they found effective or what they didn't find effective. Then having done that, take a couple minutes to make some notes to yourself, see if you want to revise your own writing such that it is more formal. That would be my proposal as one kind of fun way to work with this topic, beyond just poring over the list of rules and heavily editing the document, trying to make it fit within all of those constraints. Okay, thank you once again for sticking with me for the full of this time. And I hope you have enjoyable weeks and enjoyable writings. Be well.